What's up, everyone? Tara Roberts here with Bleacher Report. We are almost at week 2. We are wrapping week 1 up. I hope it did not hurt you too bad, but if it did hurt you, today's topic might help a little bit here. We are talking biggest bounce back candidates ahead of week 2. So go ahead, drop your comments in. Let me know your pain. Let me know if you have any questions, any needs or anything. Should you bail out on players? How much should you trust them? Anything at all, drop them in the chat here. We got a good list here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to start us off here with one that I know was very frustrating. It was personally a little bit frustrating for me, right? Terry McLaurin here, unfortunately, had a terrible week 1. 2 receptions, 4 targets, 27 yards, and it was not fun watching him fail, while on the opposite end, Deebo Samuel looked absolutely fantastic. But I am here to tell you that week 2 is a bounce back opportunity for Terry McLaurin here. Do not panic over him. I know it was painful here. But I mean, let's talk about the performance in week 1, right? 4 targets, that's never a good thing. But targets have never really been the bread and butter of Terry McLaurin. We love it when he gets a good amount of targets, but what we're really looking for from him in terms of what makes him such a great fantasy receiver is that big play value that he brings. So he doesn't have to have a lot of volume. You have those big plays, those big catches, and Jaden Daniels really brought that out in him last season in particular. The thing about him, though, is we did actually get that. It just doesn't show in the stat sheet. Unfortunately, he had a nice wide open. He beat his coverage. Deep ball from Jaden Daniels, and unfortunately, Jaden overthrew him. Now, I wonder, it's just speculation, right? There was a lot of that time off with the holdout that he had for the new contract. Maybe they just need a little second here just to readjust chemistry and timing here. Obviously, Deebo Samuel had a fantastic outing here, but targets are not the massive concern. Again, it's not unusual for Terry McLaurin to have games like this, even last year with Daniels. As a matter of fact, Terry McLaurin's week 1 last year, coincidentally, was also 2 receptions, 4 targets, 17 yards. So technically speaking, he had like a mild improvement this year, but we don't love that, right? But when we're looking at him in this offense here, just not a high volume receiver. And sometimes these games happen here. Now, Green Bay, the matchup this week, heading into week 2, obviously, Green Bay's defense, right, showed a ton of life against that Detroit offense. You wonder if it's the exit of Ben Johnson or if it's that Green Bay, not just with the addition of Micah Parsons, with extra additions that they've done and work that they've done with their defensive coordinator, if they truly have ascended to being just a particularly maybe a shutdown off our defense from a receiving perspective and a pass perspective there. But when we're looking at Jaden Daniels, he is more than equipped to deal with a defense like Green Bay, especially with that addition of Micah Parsons there, extend the plays, push the ball downfield. So even though the matchup might not be ideal in week 2, Terry McLaurin is still a strong bounce back candidate. We're not panicking. We're not selling. We're not throwing him out of our fantasy lineups. We take the good and the bad with him. Now, let's move on to our number 2 here for a second. Our number 2 panic bounce back candidate here, unfortunately, and I didn't expect this one because heading into the season, he was someone that I would note as one of the most reliable receivers in the NFL. This one here, number 6, actually, is Amon-Ra St. Brown on our list. We expect more volume from Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? 4 receptions, 6 targets, 45 receiving yards. Again, we talked about that Green Bay defense and the upgrade that they have, not just with Micah Parsons, but and Micah Parsons, just a note on that, was not playing the vast majority of the snaps there, but you could still see the clear impact that he had getting double teamed. The defense as a whole was just thriving, right? Goff stats, though. Let's talk about Goff stats, and then we can maybe analyze what happened here. Goff stats were 31 of 39. On the surface, that's excellent, right? Unfortunately, those 31 completions only amounted to 225 yards and 1 touchdown and 1 interception. So when you do the math there and you look at who actually got the targets, Gibbs had 10 targets. David Montgomery had 4 targets. Sam Laporta had 9 targets. Jameson Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown combined for 11 targets. Again, it just kind of screams like a situation here where Detroit was backed into a corner and simply couldn't push the ball downfield to receivers. And again, Green Bay's defense was a little bit underrated last year. So I'm not shocked that this transition happened here and that Amon-Ra St. Brown didn't have the most fantastic day. Again, it's easy to look at this and say, hey, the exit of Ben Johnson, he's gone. The Lions offense, they also had their one of their most reliable linemen retire as well. So you start to wonder and say, okay, is the Lions offense just cooked now? I see it less about the exit of Ben Johnson and more about the fact that maybe Green Bay's defense just massively improved even without the addition of Micah Parsons there. Maybe the defensive coordinator there was just in his bag. The Lions obviously face Chicago this week, and unfortunately for us, we've got Chicago on Monday night, so we don't get to analyze the defense as it was this year. I don't think it's fair to look at Chicago's defense last year because towards the end of the season, they did have some weird things that went on with their secondary and some inconsistencies there that were also affected by the offense. So we'll get more to look at in terms of Chicago's defense here and trying to understand what to expect from the Lions as they face them. But again, more than likely, this is going to be kind of like a mildly defensive, difficult matchup here, but one where Amon-Ra St. Brown can get more volume, and that is key for him because that volume was well below expectations and painful for fantasy managers here. Moving on to our next player here. I won't bury the lead on this one. Our fifth bounce back candidate here. Should not be a surprise that it is a bounce back candidate this week. It's Calvin Ridley, right? Again, this was definitely the player that was the most difficult player to kind of look at in week one because we knew what the situation was going to be, right? So when we were looking at Calvin Ridley, I took a lot of start sit questions this week, a lot of Calvin Ridley questions. And unfortunately, I had to say anybody and everybody's name ahead of Calvin Ridley. If someone said, are we starting Emeka Egbuka over Calvin Ridley? I said, yes, unfortunately we are because the matchup is not ideal. 4 receptions. Ugh. It did come with 8 targets, so not so bad on that. And we still at least saw volume there, but 27 yards, 2 drops. Quite frankly, he didn't look like himself. He looked a little flustered. He looked out of sync. And when we're looking at Cam Ward, it wasn't a fantastic day for him either. 12 completions, 28 attempts there, only 112 passing yards and just the fumble there, no touchdowns. I will say this, although the stat line was extremely ugly there, Cam Ward did at least look like he wasn't flustered on that end. It was a difficult defensive matchup. We should have expected, and again, this was kind of like the par for the course. We moved him back in rankings here. Tennessee surprisingly held up fairly well against Denver, all things considered, being the matchup that it is. We expected a poor performance here. So that is why he is a prime bounce back candidate, because our season-long expectations for Calvin Ridley, that's a completely different story here. We knew that heading into this week, this was just going to be flat out a bad matchup. But looking ahead to the week 2 matchup that we've got here against the LA Rams, we will talk about this one in a second because, spoiler alert here, one of the players that face the LA Rams is on this list for a bounce back candidate. So we'll dive into that in terms of the Rams defense. But week 2 for the Rams is definitely a difficult matchup for Calvin Ridley, but not the same level of shutdown corner difficulty that you get with Denver here. So that's where we're still looking at him as a potential bounce back candidate here. Now, looking at our next player here, number 4 on this list here is one that I know is going to ruffle some feathers here. It's Trevor Lawrence. He always ruffles feathers. If you're, if you see in the background, I've turned a little bit here. Obviously, you guys see that I might be a Clemson alumni here. I promise I will not be biased here when I talk about Trevor Lawrence, because quite frankly, the matchup was and the production was well below expectations here, unfortunately. Just 19 completions on 31 attempts. That's not aggressively bad, but to result in 178 passing yards against a Carolina defense that he should have, in theory, tore up. This was a matchup that most people viewed Trevor Lawrence as having QB1 upside, a top 12 performance this week. Purely due to the matchup. The addition of Travis Hunter, the change in offensive coordinator, all those are wonderful things. But at the end of the day, when you look at that matchup and you look at Carolina, you want to say that that is a matchup where teams will just be producing aggressive volume. And to be fair, They were more difficult against the pass last year. They were extremely easy to run on, and I think we saw that kind of manifest itself in Travis Etienne and his production on the ground. But regardless of that, this should have been a better performance. It did not look good at all. In an excellent matchup here. The Panthers were again definitely better against the pass than the run, but this should have been something where he should have thrived here. Now there might have been some extenuating circumstances. Weather didn't really affect the game as a whole in terms of like heavy downpours or visibility affecting them, but there was a weather delay, so I could throw that in there and say that quite frankly both teams looked extremely off after they came back from that long weather delay. Still, it was very disappointing, but the reason that we are listing Trevor Lawrence as a potential bounce back candidate here is the matchup that he is facing in week 2. In week 2, he gets that Cincinnati defense here that, hey, good for them. They were able to lock in Trey Hendrickson for another year, but quite frankly, it looked like the same Cincinnati defense that we had seen all last season. When you look on the surface, you might think that, the points that were scored by Cleveland, the interceptions that Cincinnati had, you might think that it was a good day for the Cincinnati defense when you look at the box score here. Unfortunately, I don't feel like that's the case when you actually dive into it, because 2 of those interceptions that came from Joe Flacco were the direct result of pure luck. Weird situation where both the receivers, I think one was Jerry Jeudy and one was Cedric Tillman, dove for the ball, ended up bobbling it up in the air, and then it was intercepted from that point on. So that does count as interceptions, but at the end of the day, Joe Flacco was technically dealing on the Cincinnati defense in a way that was kind of embarrassing and should not have happened here. Flacco had nearly 300 yards here, a touchdown. Without those 2 interceptions, this day might have been very different. They also had a bunch of missed field goals that contributed to the loss as well. So when you look at the Cincinnati defense, this is still an opportunity for Trevor Lawrence to come in, have a bounce back week, tear this defense apart. There was not effective utilization of Brian Thomas Jr. The utilization of Travis Hunter was very intriguing as well. Just a little bit underwhelming. He was primarily playing out of the slot there, unfortunately. So when we're looking at this and we're saying, how do we approach this team in week 2? We have to give them a little bit of a mea culpa, right? Just for this one, because perhaps it was just an off game because of the weather delay, and that we can see a good bounce back here in a far better matchup even than so against Cincinnati in week 2. Going to the chat here real quick from Peeb Snapping, how do we feel about Keenan Allen? I feel good about Keenan Allen. It's interesting. I was expecting him to be a little bit lower rostered, but I guess right before the season, people kind of picked up, and so he's not a super available waiver wire ad. But if he's out there, 100% grab. And if you've got him on your bench, as I do, because I drafted a lot before he signed, just kind of at the end of the draft, stashing, saying he's going to land somewhere. And he looked fine in Chicago, a little bit slower in Chicago, a little bit bigger in Chicago, I'm not going to lie. But the production was still there. So when we're looking at him and you're wondering maybe, is this someone that I can trust and put into my starting lineup? I will be moving him up to a flex option because the snaps and target share were very, very clear. The rookies, Trey Harris, Keandre Lambert-Smith, did not crack 25% of snaps. They were very underutilized. It was very much so Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, Keenan Allen. Keenan played a little bit over 60% of snaps. The target shares between all of them were very good. So I feel very comfortable with Keenan Allen as a potential flex option for next week. And I think that when we look at the Chargers and the level of volume that they had through the air. Now, granted that it's easier to attack Kansas City's defense through the air, so that's probably why they tilted a little bit towards the air. But I do think we kind of give them a little bit too much in terms of saying, oh, they're going to be run heavy. They're going to be run heavy. Herbert looked amazing. Absolutely fantastic. I think they're going to continue to push volume through the air there with him. Now going to my number 3 here. I tilted my hat when I talked about that LA Rams defense here. My number 3 bounce back candidate this week is Nico Collins. Oh, what a week for Nico Collins. This one was personally painful, right? 3 receptions, 5 targets, 25 yards in a matchup where he was legitimately the only person that CJ Stroud should have even thrown to. But unfortunately, we got just this underwhelming production. And a lot of that probably did have to do with the matchup with the LA Rams. But again, this should have been a smash play for Nico Collins heading into the matchup. Again, we didn't expect the rookie receivers to make a big impact just because we hadn't seen a massive pop in preseason. They didn't make a big impact in the game at all. The absence of Christian Kirk, we thought would just create a hyper target funnel to Nico Collins, and it just didn't happen. Now, Houston Center did suffer an injury, but one lineman shouldn't destroy you. The line, I don't think it's prepared to carry through them throughout the season. But I think the real story here and why I am 100% on board with Nico Collins for a big bounce back week here is the Rams defense is for real. Incredibly underrated. And if you're looking for a fantasy defense to pick up, they are widely available on waivers. A option that you can carry throughout the season because they just produce in terms of creating turnovers, forcing fumbles, interceptions, sacks. They're truly strong, particularly their defensive line here. So I'm not surprised that they were able to just give CJ Stroud fits on top of fits. 19 completions for less than 200 yards. Majority of the targets were two tight ends. So again, that kind of leads you to believe that they were just struggling to get the ball downfield, and Nico Collins suffered. In week 2, we've got a far friendlier matchup here for Nico Collins against that Tampa Bay defense here, who it's friendlier, right? They can pull things together and they can get stout, but they did allow a pretty solid performance there to Michael Penix Jr., who had nearly 300 yards. Could have been a little bit more productive through the day, but ended up getting one of his touchdowns on the ground. Had a top 12 performance here, so the opportunity is there for CJ Stroud to have a bounce back performance and for Nico Collins to be the clear target hog in that offense. Now, the good thing here, the good takeaway that we can have is that the rookies didn't really make an impact, right? Jalen Noel, Jaden Higgins, they were on the field, did not make any kind of significant contribute or make any massive garner any massive target share in the offense. So it should, in theory, continue to be Nico Collins. We just have to make sure that we get the Texans in a good situation where they're not getting destroyed with their offensive line, unfortunately. That's the only thing that we have to really key in there. But bounce back opportunity here is strong against Tampa Bay in week 2 for him. I'm going to go to the chat here real quick, and this is perfect. From Sean Monroe, how do we feel about AJ Brown? I'll tell you how we feel about AJ Brown. AJ Brown is my number 2 on this list, unfortunately. But fortunately, I do have him on here for a prime bounce back candidate. He's up here at the highest, or almost at the highest level for our prime bounce back candidates here, because the matchup, I think, is what's key here. When we look at 2024, you can start to get, like last season, you can start to get a little bit concerned about AJ Brown, right? Because 2024 was Brown's poorest season in Philadelphia, finishes wide receiver 20 in PPR, only played in 13 games, very low receptions. Touchdowns just weren't what we expect of him, only 7 touchdowns. Yardage wasn't super high as well, a little over 1,000 yards. The hope for that was that, we could just attribute that to just being kind of an outlier year. He had been dealing with injury and whatnot, because the appeal of AJ Brown was consistency and knowing that he's always just one big play away from paying off. The big play never came through in week 1, so we ended up with what we ended up with: 1 reception. Oh my God, 1 reception, 8 yards. I'm commiserating with you if you started him. I played him in 1 league, and that hole in your lineup, that's a pain that you cannot overcome, right? That one's going to sting for a while. But when you look at the matchup here, the Dallas defense, it looked like the best way that Philadelphia decided to attack this Dallas defense was not through the air, because the secondary would be their strength. They attacked it at the front, right? Trying to attack it on the ground there. Makes a lot of sense, right? Even though Saquon Barkley didn't have a productive fantasy day, we had a lot of Jalen Hurts on the ground. We got a good amount of Saquon as well. The receivers just didn't have a lot. So when you look at the matchup, it does kind of make sense. But why I love AJ Brown for a bounce back in week 2 is that we talked about the LA Chargers and the uptick in pass volume that they had against Kansas City. Some of that being that obviously Justin Herbert is fantastic. Why not throw? But really, when you look at Kansas City, their strength is on the ground. You cannot run on them. That's why I say when you look at Amari Hampton this week, don't panic over that. Nobody runs on Kansas City, unfortunately. They just tend to shut down people on the ground. That's their strength. But man, can you attack them through the air? And that's exactly what we saw with the LA Chargers. I do expect them to obviously continue to, when we're talking about Philadelphia, they're not going to abandon the run against Kansas City. That's just not how they operate. But we've seen Saquon, shut down a little bit by them in the past. So when we're looking at this offense, I would not be shocked if we see Jalen Hurts push more volume through the air and we finally get that production here that we were expecting this week from A.J. Brown here. So again, matchup this week, far more friendly. And when I say that Kansas City's offense, our defense is definitely tends to lean more towards their being easier to attack through the air. That's across the board. That is just not a Justin Herbert thing this year. When you look back to last year, even quarterbacks like Bryce Young, who we saw obviously struggle a lot in week one, threw very well on Kansas City last year. And when we look at the Kansas City defense and the changes that they did or did not make in the offseason, I don't feel like they made enough changes to really change the trajectory of that secondary. So I would expect more of the same here in terms of us being able to target teams through the air and look for bounce back weeks against Kansas City here. So we're pro AJ Brown. I know it's I know it was painful, but don't panic here. And that includes Devonta Smith as well. He's not on this list, but kind of in tandem there because he had a very underwhelming game as well. Going to the chat here from BNN81 twice. What are your thoughts on RJ Harvey? My thoughts on RJ Harvey are unfortunately I was kind of shocked here. The logic made sense. He was like, let's compare rookie running backs. Like obviously Ashton Genty on another level, but when we're looking at a guy like Travion Henderson versus RJ Harvey, my concern with RJ Harvey was that unlike Travion Henderson, where we would say, okay, it should be a 50-50 split, and that's kind of what we got from the New England backfield. We don't really know what to expect from the Denver backfield. And logic says that RJ Harvey is an incredibly talented running back who thrives through the air from a pass catching perspective, and that he was praised all off season long by Sean Payton, by Bo Nix, that this was something that he really excelled in. And so to go out there and see them minimally use him in the pass game and throw a bunch of targets at Tyler Bidet, that was weird. And I'm getting kind of concerned that the vision that we have for Sean Payton and what he executed in New Orleans is not something that he, I don't know, maybe remembers how to execute. Because you would think J.K. Dobbins, R.J. Harvey makes a lot of sense in terms of how you could make it productive from a committee standpoint. But when you're inserting another back in there who has not had success literally anywhere, unfortunately, you start to get concerned that maybe Sean doesn't really have a preference in terms of what directions he's heading. So I am concerned about RJ Harvey. The talent is there. It's just a split backfield. And if it's going to be a split backfield where he's randomly throwing another running back in there to kind of see how it shakes out, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So he will be further down in my rankings. He was still kind of like a low-end flex option for me this week, but it's getting even lower this week, unfortunately, here. Not a fan. Let's move on to my number one here. My number one here is a combo. My combination of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase for bounce back candidates in week 2 here. If raise your hand, jump in the chat if you were hurt by Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase here. If you got that stack, it was a frustrating week for you. It stung from a fantasy perspective. Cleveland was not the most ideal matchup, right? But we expect more from Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase here. Now, I will say, the last 2 matchups against Cleveland last season, right? Because, division, we have multiple sample sizes here. Burrow had a total of 5 touchdowns. So touchdowns should have come here. Even if the yardage was a little bit suspect, right? We would expect that there should have been a higher level of opportunities here. Even in those matchups, when you look at Jamar Chase specifically, who had a whopping 2 receptions for 26 yards on 5 targets. 5 targets is just outrageous and egregious, right? when you look at Jamar Chase in those matchups against Cleveland last year, he had top 12 finishes for both those matchups. So despite the fact that Cleveland is an overall, adequate defense, this should have been something that they still should have been able to put up wide receiver 1 and QB1 numbers against. Now, when we look at the matchup in week 2, it gets interesting here because they face a Jacksonville defense that was fairly stingy in week 1. Now, it is tough to judge, right, in terms of how good Jacksonville's defense actually was and how whether it was just that Carolina was just flat out awful. And again, I mentioned that weather delay and kind of whether or not that affected things there. The Jags are interesting because they do have the ability to kind of, pull things together from a defensive perspective because they don't have any massive outlier, weaknesses at positions, if you will. So it could be possible that maybe they turn things around and the Jags defense is good, but I still think it's an opportunity here for the Bengals, both Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow, to have a bounce back. And here's another positive here. When you're looking at the Bengals and Joe Burrow in particular, 23 pass attempts for Joe Burrow, 113 pass yards, that's not going to repeat. As a matter of fact, I just wanted to verify and I went back and looked. We have not seen Joe Burrow throw below 25 attempts there in last time we saw that was 2021, I believe. So this is just outrageous. We should not see this level of production for him. And more than likely, this was just a situation where the Browns schemed up a way to just kind of shut it down. And this is just a massive outlier performance. You're going to see Jamar Chase and have a bounce back week, and you're going to see Joe Burrow as well. You're not panicking, right? You're not panicking here. You're starting them. You're always starting Jamar Chase. But I feel like we need to point out Joe Burrow specifically because occasionally we do try to get a little bit cute at quarterback, and especially because we had some quarterbacks give very strong performances like Justin Fields, Michael Penix, I talked about as well. There were a lot of guys who in that lower end streaming option did pop up with strong performances here. So it's possible that you might be, excuse me, you might be sitting there and wondering, like, do I sit Joe Burrow? Do I stream somebody else? No, we're gonna push forward. We're gonna start. We're going to see more volume here. This was just a weird outlier week here. I'm gonna go to the chat here real quick before we close things out. From D Tom 78, is Gibbs an honorable mention? Honestly, we could have done an honorable mention for the entire Detroit offense. I did talk about Jared Goff's stats and how underwhelming they were. Gibbs is a concern because while the overall fantasy production did benefit from the fact that he got a massive amount of targets, lack of production overall was an issue here. So I'm not going to put him on here as a guy that we're panicking about, but it was underwhelming for what we expected here, especially when we were told we were going to be getting more Gibbs, more production, more upside here. This was a guy that we were drafting sometimes ahead of Saquon Barkley because we were worried about that regression for Saquon Barkley there. So this is not the production that we want to see out of him. It pales in comparison with the guy that you were drafting literally right at the same spot of Jahmyr Gibbs, who had a fantastic week, thriving through the air as well. So yeah, we're concerned. He could be an honorable mention here. I do have a few more honorable mentions that I can mention real quick. Guys like Kenneth Walker, I didn't put him on this list because he's an honorable mention, but I'm a little bit concerned that we won't get the bounce back this week. Bo Nix, a guy that could get a bounce back week. I talked about Bryce Young, Tua Tagovailoa, not on this list, obviously, because I'm concerned there is no bounce back period here. Isaiah Pacheco, that's another one where would in theory be a bounce back candidate, but unfortunately it's looking like we might have a major issue going on there with the run game in the split backfield, although I would expect we get more volume opportunity here. Going to the chat here again from Aju John. Should I pick up, good question here. Should I pick up Fannin or Juwan Johnson? I like both. I do a top 10 waiver wire video, and they're both on my top 10 waiver wire ads, but I do have Juwan Johnson higher, and there's a very specific reason for that. But I do think Fannin is worth an ad as well for anybody who was wondering. But with Juwan Johnson, the reason that I have him higher is because when you look at the way that he was utilized in that offense, that was something that we have not seen before. It feels like this is a shift in usage of the tight end position that we are seeing with Kellen Moore. And we got to remember that a lot of this lack of inconsistent production that we've had from Juwan Johnson in the past was with a different coaching staff that was in love with Taysom Hill and utilizing multiple tight ends and Foster Moreau and whatnot. When we look at Juwan Johnson's production this week, he had the highest snap count of any Saints player outside of obviously Spencer Rattler, right? In the offensive line. He had the highest routes run of anyone in the Saints offense. So that is a dramatic shift in his usage. We haven't seen that before here. So I lean towards Juwan Johnson because I feel like we could be getting a little preview here of the vision that Kellen Moore has for integrating Johnson from a pass catching perspective and committing to him as the tight end rather than getting cute and playing around with other guys who don't have the same skill set from a pass catching perspective. Chat here from Monty Lane. What is good? But again, I do like Harold Fannin Jr. Just for the reference, someone that you should add. That's my second tight end that I would add behind him for sure, because when a rookie pops like that, you cannot ignore it. From Monty Lane, what is going on with Seattle? Who is the main back? This one was frustrating, right? I do mildly wonder, right, because we had news prior to week one and throughout preseason that the reason that Kenneth Walker was sitting was because he had foot soreness. So I will add the caveat that maybe that had some kind of bearing in terms of them wanting to maybe make volume spread a little bit more evenly. But the problem is that Charbonnet just did look better than Kenneth Walker. The split was not ideal. We would expect Walker to be a 3-down back. Now, I will say, at least from the benefit of third down perspective, we did see receptions, what little receptions that they did have. I would expect an uptick because that was just a tiny amount that Seattle didn't really do last year. I would see a little uptick there. They did throw to Kenneth Walker a lot more last year. But he did get those targets in the offense compared to Zach Charbonnet in week one. So maybe we have a little bit of reprieve there in the future that we can get a little bit more fantasy production out of him because he is the preferred back from a receptions perspective. But I am concerned. I am concerned that maybe as we start to look at them in that offense and the fact that Zach Charbonnet is out producing him, that we get more into a split backfield, and we don't want to do that in that offense because they are fairly even. They're not a run heavy offense. It wasn't an ideal day for Sam Darnold. And given the matchup, I can understand why that is. Moving forward, we probably should get a little bit more pass volume out of him. And if the backfield is split that way, that is a major concern there, unfortunately. So I'm worried about Kenneth Walker. That was one of my honorable mentions there. And the reason why he was not on that list that we have here is because these are guys that I think can bounce back. And Kenneth Walker is one that I'm concerned will not bounce back in week 2. We got to see how that plays out because that was highly concerning here. But that wraps things up. Let's recap here for a little bit. We had Terry McLaurin there. With the terrible day, unfortunately, for Washington against the Giants there. We expect to bounce back because, again, it was just a weird day for him. It happens every now and then. He's a big play receiver, and sometimes you got to take those L's with him. Amon-Ra St. Brown with the matchup, hoping that maybe a defense upgrade there for Green Bay had something to do with the way that the offense struggled. And it's not that, unfortunately, Detroit is falling off there with the exit of Ben Johnson. Calvin Ridley, prime candidate for a bounce back this week. Bad week 1 matchup. He pulled Denver. It's excusable there. Then we have Trevor Lawrence as well, hoping for a bounce back here this week against Cincinnati, an ideal matchup for him. Nico Collins, who unfortunately didn't take advantage of the opportunity to be the primary target there. Tough matchup with the LA Rams. We expect him to bounce back in a better matchup this week, hopefully. Then AJ Brown, number 2, much better matchup this week. We just kind of attribute to lack of pass volume there in Philadelphia for the way that they wanted to attack the Dallas defense. Kansas City matchup this week, much more advantageous for pass volume here. So bounce back candidate strong here for AJ Brown. And then finally here, the combination of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Unfortunately, week one was wildly disappointing. We have not seen that low production out of Joe Burrow in a very, very long time. That's atypical. We should see an uptick in volume from him. And we love the opportunity for him in a bounce back in week two. But that wraps things up, guys. I appreciate you joining in. I hope that these guys didn't hurt you too bad in week one here. Make sure that you've got your alerts on because, again, we're in fantasy season. Week one is almost over. We're heading into week two. We'll be here with you all week long and all season long to help you win your leagues. By the way, you can find me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time. Have a fantastic week. Good luck with your lineups. I hope we have better news next week. And I'll talk to you again in week three.